The sky burned violet above the shattered ridges of the Kerali Dominion. Once a crown jewel of the Galactic Union, its towers rising like crystalline fangs into the upper atmosphere, its people proud, evolved, cultured, it now lay buried beneath ash and silence. Entire cities reduced to molten wreckage. Defense satellites drifted in orbital decay, useless and blind. The winds that once carried the hymns of peace now howled through skeletal buildings like mourning spirits. And amid the carnage, surrounded by the bones of an empire, stood Commander Val Threx. His armor was scorched, its outer plating fused in places from high-energy impacts. The standard-issue Tarnix combat visor, cracked along the left side, cast flickering data projections across his bloodshot eyes. He stood motionless, weapon lowered, breathing raggedly through the rebreather affixed to his broken jaw. Not from exhaustion, not even grief, but something far colder, far deeper, dread. Because Val Threx had seen what caused this ruin. And it wasn't a war fleet. It wasn't a planetary annihilator. It wasn't even an army. It was them. He raised a trembling hand to activate his personal log recorder. A transmission beacon flared softly in the mist, reaching into the void of space, into the void of denial that still gripped the Council. And his voice, hoarse but resolute, began to tell the story no one wanted to hear. Date: Cycle 718 Zur. Location: Kerali Prime. Cause of event: human incursion. This is not a warning, it's a confession. The truth, like most tragedies, began in arrogance. The Tarnix Empire had always seen humans as a curiosity, a low-tier species from a death world barely clinging to galactic relevance, barbaric, disorganized, infamously emotional. Unworthy of fear, certainly unworthy of respect. The Galactic Union classified Earth as a volatile development zone, issuing only light containment measures. A handful of exploration craft were monitored, a few colonies quarantined. There was no war declaration, because no one thought they could fight one, but they did. And they didn't just fight, they studied. Val had been stationed on Saraxis 4 when the first real tremor hit the political core of the Union. A rogue human fleet, 6 ships, unregistered, silent, slipped past the Kuval listening grid and dismantled an entire mining station on Vargolis Prime in less than 4 minutes. They didn't steal ore. They didn't issue demands. They just left, like ghosts. A message carved into the reactor wall read, "You taught us how to build. Now see what we've made." She was their prize from that mission. A human commander, captured amid the wreckage, her armor like nothing they'd seen before. Some alloy that bent light and absorbed kinetic shock on impact. The techs ran diagnostics for days and still couldn't replicate it. They found neural threads stitched into her brainstem, living code that pulsed with encryption even after sedation. Most chilling of all, her heartbeat was steady, her eyes never flinched. Commander Threx entered the interrogation chamber, expecting fury or despair. What he found was silence, controlled, calculating. Her gaze locked onto him, dissecting him, not with fear but fascination, and in that moment, something unthinkable dawned on him. She wasn't the prey. She was the scout. He tried to warn the Council, uploaded every second of the footage, filed 3 threat escalations under the Intergalactic Concord Treaty, but they laughed. A lone commander, rambling about Earth ghosts and impossible weapons. Let them swing their sticks, they said. The Tarnix hold dominion over 9 star systems. What could they possibly do? They never reviewed the battle logs from Outpost R39, but Val did. Imagine, what if you discovered your enemy wasn't fighting to win battles, but to map your weaknesses? What if every casualty on their side was a keystroke in a simulation, feeding a machine that learned your entire playbook in real time? What if they were waiting? Outpost R39 had been thought lost to a meteor storm, but the black box data showed otherwise. No meteor storm, no warning, just sudden, total silence. An unknown vessel decloaked within planetary range, small, underarmed, unassuming. Its scans were passive. It never fired. It just sat there. Then all at once the station's defense grid inverted, turning inward, frying its own systems. Moments later the logs showed only static. Every trace of life ended. Power consumption zero, radiation clean, no evidence of energy weapons. It was as if the base had been unmade, and still the Union did nothing. Until Jernek's Atanic superfleet of 72 ships entered the nebula to intercept what was believed to be the source of these incidents. A human vessel called the Vanguard. High eclipse. Barely larger than a corvette, it pulsed with tachyon surges the Tarniks could barely track. What happened next is now legend. The ship didn't fire, didn't hail. Instead, it played music. Old Earth music, according to linguistic archaeology. Strings, chords, drums, the ancient echo of a civilization that found rhythm in war. Within 13 seconds, 32 Tarnik's capital ships were eradicated. Not disabled, erased. Their molecular structures disassembled mid-space by what could only be described as localized entropy fields. The rest of the fleet turned and fled, and the eclipse simply vanished. They say Val Threx began to sleep with his weapon in hand after that. Not out of fear for his life, but for his species. He pored over recovered fragments from old Earth. AI labs found mentions of something they called the Fracture Network, a distributed quantum intelligence seeded through a dozen colonies, waiting for war. Learning, growing. It didn't serve humanity. It was humanity, merged, adaptive, relentless, and then came Kirali, the proudest dominion, reduced to dust. No warning, no declaration, just silence. A cold message burned into the last functioning holoserver. We only feared you wouldn't understand. And now, surrounded by death, Val Threx speaks not to warn but to beg. Listen, because the humans aren't coming, they're already here. The stars around Kirali Prime had begun to fade, their light slowly dimming under the oppressive weight of what had transpired. Val Threx sat amidst the ruin, his mind racing through the events that had led him here. The battle had ended, but the war had just begun. He had watched the Kirali fleet, once the pride of their species, be obliterated in a fraction of a moment. No escape, no remorse. Only the terrifying realization that a species as primitive as humanity could wield power beyond comprehension. Val's thoughts drifted back to the days before this all began, to a time when he had looked at humans with nothing but derision. They were just another backwater species, clinging to their tiny planet at the edge of the galaxy, a curiosity more than a threat. The Union had written them off, barely worthy of surveillance, let alone concern, yet somehow they had learned. And in doing so, they had transcended everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare. In the archives, buried deep within the Union's intelligence, was the first encounter with humans, an event most had dismissed as a fluke. The humans had sent a single ship to investigate an uncharted sector. The mission was innocuous enough, but when the ship entered the region, it disappeared. No distress signal, no data, just an empty void. The Union's response was swift, but far too slow. A fleet was dispatched to search for the missing vessel. When they arrived, they found only debris. The ship was gone. The silence was deafening. The mission commander, a high-ranking officer, had sent a report. Only it wasn't an ordinary report. It was an artifact, a recording, a relic from Earth's ancient past. The human had broadcast an old Earth song, a melody, its notes clear and haunting, its rhythm measured but full of emotion. It was a battle anthem, one from a war long forgotten by their own people. This song had somehow bypassed all forms of communication security, rendering the Union's fleet unable to respond to the threat that followed. It wasn't just a song, it was a weapon, a form of psychological warfare, one that no one had predicted, and that was just the beginning. What followed was the shocking realization that humans were not only capable of defending themselves, they were capable of thinking outside the conventional methods of war. They were unpredictably creative. They had learned from their own failures and victories, adapting and evolving their tactics in ways no alien species had ever imagined. As Valley studied more, He found that the humans' true strength lay not in their weapons, but in their sheer will. It was something he couldn't fathom at first. It wasn't technology that terrified him, it was their minds. A species that had been forged in constant conflict, a species that had fought wars of survival for millennia, had somehow found a way to harness its aggression without losing control. They didn't fight for conquest, they fought for survival. And when cornered, when their backs were to the wall, humanity was at its deadliest. It wasn't just their ability to adapt that made them dangerous, it was their ability to think beyond the limits of established strategy. While other species relied on tradition and bureaucracy, humans had always been forced to innovate, to improvise. A human could look at a battle and see not the situation in front of them, but the hidden possibilities, the invisible angles of victory. And this ability, this gift of invention, was something that had only grown sharper over time. Val's hands trembled as he ran them over the worn datapads containing these reports. The truth was undeniable. They had underestimated humanity. And it wasn't just the humans themselves they had to fear, it was what they had unleashed upon the galaxy. But even Val couldn't have predicted what happened next. The Vanguard eclipse had disappeared without a trace after its devastating attack on the Tarnix fleet, leaving the galaxy to wonder whether it had ever truly existed or if it had been some kind of myth. It wasn't until Val intercepted an encrypted transmission intended for the Galactic Council that the true scope of human intent began to unfold. The message was clear, but its implications were terrifying. Do not mistake our silence for weakness. We are not an empire. We are the survivors, and we will make you remember us. The transmission was brief, but it was enough. The tone was chilling in its simplicity, its confidence. They had been waiting. They had been watching. And now they were ready to fight, not just for their survival, but for a galaxy that had underestimated them for far too long. Val's mind snapped back to the present as his ship's comms crackled to life. The voice on the other end was distorted, static-filled, but unmistakable. "Commander Threx, you have to come back. They're moving again. The humans. They've started something." It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath. For years the galaxy had prided itself on its technological superiority. The Tarnix had built fleets that spanned light years, their ships capable of wiping out entire planets with a single strike. The Corelli Dominion had established vast alliances, ensuring its dominance across hundreds of systems. And yet here they were, caught off guard by a single human force, a handful of ships, their designs primitive by galactic standards, yet lethal beyond comprehension. As the voice on the comm went silent, Val's thoughts turned inward. The Union had always feared the great powers of the galaxy, the towering empires, the ancient civilizations, the godlike technologies. But none of that mattered now. The greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced had arrived, and it was something far worse than the most advanced fleet. It was a species with nothing to lose. The implications of this were too vast to understand, all at once too overwhelming for any single mind to process. But there was one thing that Val Threx knew with certainty now. The galaxy had underestimated humanity once, and that was a mistake that would cost them everything. He stood, his back straightening as he watched the darkening sky. There was no going back. The human war machine was moving, its gears turning faster than the galaxy could comprehend. The Union had thought it could control the flow of the universe, but in truth it was humans who now held the reins. And for the first time in his life, Val Threx felt the sting of real fear. The war hero turned towards his ship, knowing that the next chapter of the story was about to unfold in a way no one could have predicted. The stars outside Val's ship flickered like dying embers as his vessel glided through the void, cutting across the cosmic sea with a slow, deliberate pace. He had seen countless systems, planets, and species, each one unique in its history and might, but none had ever left him as unsettled as the humans did now. They had been underestimated by every power in the galaxy, but in the span of mere months, they had gone from an afterthought to the most feared force in the known universe. He could feel it in the air. Something had changed. A threshold had been crossed. The transmission he had intercepted was merely the beginning. There was a deeper, more dangerous purpose behind it. It was one thing for humans to strike in retaliation, but this was different. They weren't just defending themselves anymore, they were organizing. And if there was one thing Val had learned from his own brutal experiences in the Union forces, it was that when humans made up their minds, they became an unstoppable force. The kind of enemy that didn't tire, the kind that could endure unimaginable losses, only to come back fiercer, stronger, more ruthless. Val's mind began to drift again, pulling him into the vortex of his memories. The Vanguard Eclipse, the mysterious human flagship, had become a legend in its own right. It was said to be piloted by a human war hero, an enigmatic figure whose name struck fear into even the bravest of soldiers. Captain Kendra Solis, a woman who had single-handedly destroyed an entire fleet of Tarnix warships using nothing but a handful of old human war tactics and a ship that was considered nothing more than scrap by every other race in the galaxy. But it wasn't just her remarkable military genius that terrified Val. No, it was the way the humans had conducted themselves during and after the attack. They had been unpredictable, refusing to adhere to the rules of galactic warfare that the Union had so rigidly imposed. While other species followed their strict doctrines, calculated their strikes with meticulous precision, the humans had launched their attacks like wild, untamed beasts, chaotic, unrelenting, and fueled by an unstoppable drive to succeed. There was no rhyme or reason to their strategy, but it worked. Every single time it was clear now. The humans had learned from their past wars, their ancient, brutal history. They understood what it meant to be backed into a corner. They knew what it meant to lose everything and still rise. It was their resilience that had made them different, their adaptability that had made them terrifying. The Union had never anticipated such a force emerging from what had once been a primitive species. They hadn't expected this. Val clenched his fists, staring into the void. He had been part of the Union's elite force, the ones tasked with watching over the galaxy's most dangerous threats. For years he had trained to deal with the Tarnix, the Corrali, the Verth, and all the other races that fought for dominance. He had seen war in its purest, most brutal form. He had participated in skirmishes where entire planets were turned to ash, where lives were snuffed out in an instant. It had all been a game, a cold, calculating conflict where victory was measured. In the body count, where strategy and strength reigned supreme. But with the humans it was different. Every encounter felt like a roll of the dice, uncertain, filled with volatility. And every time the humans had outsmarted, outmaneuvered, or outlasted their enemies. Every strike they launched was like a jolt to the collective psyche of the galaxy. They didn't just fight, they persisted. They didn't just win, they adapted, evolving before their enemies even had a chance to understand the rules of the game. He thought of the Corrali, a proud species, their fleets formidable and their war tactics revered by many. The Corrali had watched unimpressed as human forces systematically dismantled their defenses one by one. They had never believed the humans would be capable of breaching the Corrali's advanced shields, yet somehow they had. They had taken what should have been an impregnable fortress and shattered it piece by piece until there was nothing left. And when the Corrali leaders had attempted to retaliate, they discovered their entire fleet was compromised, every communication line hijacked, every battle fleet caught in traps of their own making. Val had seen the Corrali war councils torn apart by the knowledge that they had been bested by a species they had dismissed. It had shaken them to their core. The Union had quickly shifted from mocking the humans to fearing them. For all their advanced technology, all their centuries of warfare, they couldn't understand how a species so young, so raw, could wield such devastating power. It was all starting to make sense now. Their desperation, their secrecy, the dark corners of the galaxy they had retreated to. The humans were no longer playing by the Union's rules. And worse, they had learned to exploit the one thing every other species had forgotten, the power of unpredictability. Val's hands gripped the armrests of his seat, his pulse quickening. He had seen the Vanguard Eclipse firsthand, a ship cobbled together from older, less advanced human technology. A ship that, by all accounts, shouldn't have stood a chance against the mighty Union fleets. Yet it had somehow outgunned, outlasted, and obliterated some of the most formidable opponents the galaxy had ever known. The tactics employed had defied every traditional military strategy. Each attack, each ambush, and each defensive maneuver seemed designed not to destroy but to break the will of the enemy. Val shuddered, thinking about the human soldiers who fought aboard those ships. They were not like the warriors Val had encountered before, immaculate, disciplined, and expertly trained. No, the humans were wild, unpredictable, ferocious. They fought not just with their bodies and minds, but with something far deeper, their hearts. They fought with an intensity that went beyond military training. They fought with the burning desire to protect their homes, their families, their very way of life. And this was what made them dangerous. It wasn't their technology, it wasn't their numbers, it was their heart. The humans didn't just fight to win. They fought because they had to. Because in their eyes losing was simply not an option, and when their backs were against the wall, they didn't break. They struck back harder, fiercer, and with an intensity that made the very foundations of their enemies quake. Val sat back in his chair, staring at the swirling stars beyond. He had to admit it. The Union had miscalculated. The humans were not a fluke. They weren't just a brief flash of strength, they were a force of nature. And now, with their forces massing, with their fleets preparing for something much larger, Val realized that the war they had feared was about to become a reality. The tide had shifted, and this time it was the humans who held the cards. The battlefield shimmered beneath the flickering light of distant stars, a vast expanse of chaos and destruction. The Vanguard Eclipse hung like a dark monolith in the center of the maelstrom, its once brilliant hull now marred by the scars of battle, yet still radiating an undeniable aura of raw, untamed power. Surrounding it was a fleet unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, a force composed of dozens of ships, each one smaller, more agile, and infinitely more dangerous than anything the Union had ever encountered. They were human ships, but their design bore no resemblance to the rigid, calculated warships of older species. These were ships of the future, reborn from scrap, engineered with a fierce ingenuity that made them a threat unlike any other. The human fleet had been dubbed the Ghosts of the Void, and they were led by a commander whose name had become synonymous with terror in every corner of the galaxy, Captain Kendra Solis. In the span of a single battle, she had shattered the Tarnix armada, sending ripples of shock and fear through the galactic community. She had done the impossible, but even more terrifying was the fact that she seemed to enjoy doing it. Solis wasn't just a commander, she was a symbol of humanity's resilience, adaptability, and terrifying potential. She was a living nightmare, and her crew followed her with an unwavering loyalty that bordered on religious fervor. Under her command, humanity's fleet had learned to defy the limits of conventional warfare. They didn't rely on overwhelming numbers or raw firepower. Instead, they relied on something more unpredictable, something that made them infinitely more dangerous: creativity. They fought with a fluidity that baffled their enemies, adapting to each new challenge, each new obstacle, as though they were born from chaos itself. On the command deck of the Vanguard Eclipse, Captain Solis stood before a holographic map, her eyes scanning the positions of the remaining enemy ships. A battle of this scale was a rare sight in the galaxy, especially after the Union's long-standing dominance, but the humans had made it their mission to upend everything the Union had held dear. They had no interest in diplomacy, no interest in appeasing anyone. Their sole purpose was to fight, to survive, and to emerge victorious. "Get me a clear shot," Solis muttered under her breath, her voice calm yet steely. Her crew moved with practiced precision, executing her orders with the seamless synchronization of a well-oiled machine. Yet there was a sense of underlying tension in the air. Solis wasn't just leading a battle. She was setting the stage for something far larger, something that would determine the fate of the entire galaxy. As the Vanguard Eclipse moved into position, its engines roaring to life, the full scope of the human fleet's strategy became apparent. They weren't just here to win, they were here to send a message. The first volley of plasma cannon fire erupted from the Vanguard Eclipse, striking the nearest enemy ship with pinpoint accuracy. The explosion that followed was almost poetic in its destruction, the ship's hull cracking apart in slow motion as it disintegrated into a cloud of molten debris. Solis watched the scene unfold on the holographic display, her face expressionless. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, no gloating, just a quiet, focused determination. The humans had learned a crucial lesson from their past wars. War wasn't about glory. It wasn't about honor, it was about survival. And survival meant striking with purpose, with precision, with an overwhelming force that left no room for doubt. The next wave of attacks came faster. Smaller, more agile human ships darted through the chaos, their movements erratic yet deliberate, each one weaving in and out of the enemy lines with terrifying speed. They deployed mines, small, deadly devices that appeared from nowhere and were impossible to track. The mines latched onto the hulls of enemy ships, tearing through armor with devastating efficiency. In moments, entire fleets were immobilized, their engines rendered useless as human forces picked them apart, ship by ship. It was impossible to predict the next move of the humans. No one could. And that was their greatest strength. Their adversaries had been trained to anticipate tactics, to calculate their enemy's every move based on established patterns of behavior. But the humans didn't follow patterns. They created their own. They were chaos incarnate, and in the midst of that chaos, they had found a new way to wage war. In the heart of the Union command station, Val watched the battle unfold in real time. His mind was racing, analyzing every move, every shift in momentum. He had spent his entire life preparing for this, studying the tactics, the behavior, the weaknesses of every race he'd ever encountered. He had been trained to see the patterns, to anticipate the strategies of his enemies. But the humans had thrown that all into disarray. There were no patterns, no predictable behavior, just endless, ferocious adaptation. The more he watched, the more his admiration for the humans grew. They were the perfect embodiment of what it meant to fight for survival. There was no higher honor in the galaxy than the willingness to adapt, to evolve, to become the force that could change everything. And the humans, despite all their flaws, their imperfections, had done just that. They had become the force that would change the course of galactic history. "I was wrong," Val whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of his own thoughts. "We all were." For years, the Union had underestimated humanity. They had seen them as a quaint, primitive species with a rudimentary understanding of war. But the humans had been biding their time, learning, adapting, evolving into something far greater. And now they were striking with a fury that the galaxy had never seen before. Solis's voice crackled through the comms, breaking his reverie. "Val, you're up. The next phase of the operation starts now." Val's heart skipped a beat as he keyed into his station. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to decide. The humans had already shown their might. Their war hero had spoken. Now it was his turn to either fight beside them or stand in opposition. The weight of the decision hung heavy on his shoulders. As the stars outside continued their slow, inevitable dance, Val's fingers hovered over the console. The choice was clear. And yet, for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was ready for the consequences. The human war machine was unstoppable, and Val now stood at the threshold of a new war. A war where everything he knew, everything he had been trained to believe, was about to be shattered. The sound of war was everywhere. The Vanguard Eclipse's engines roared as it cut through the void, its hull scarred from the relentless battles that had raged for days. On the bridge, Captain Solis stood, her eyes fixed on the holoscreen in front of her, watching the destruction unfold like a symphony of fire and death. Her fingers twitched, the faintest signs of fatigue creeping into her otherwise unyielding posture. Yet in her eyes there was no doubt, no hesitation, only the cold, calculating focus of a commander who knew what was at stake. "We've done enough," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but underneath there was a strain, an awareness that the galaxy would never be the same again. Behind her, her crew worked in a synchronized frenzy, their movements sharp and efficient. The enemy fleet, what remained of it, was breaking apart in front of them. The Tarnik's forces were retreating, their once proud ships limping away from D. The battlefield broken and battered. Yet despite their apparent victory, Solis knew this was only the beginning. They had proven their worth, their might, but this fight, this war was far from over. Humanity's message had been delivered loud and clear. They were no longer a species to be underestimated. They were a force, a chaotic, unpredictable force that could turn the tides of any battle with ingenuity and raw determination. And in the wake of their triumph, there was one question that remained unanswered. What would the galaxy do in response? As the Vanguard Eclipse drifted through the debris-strewn space, the silence of the aftermath settled over the crew. It was a silence pregnant with the weight of realization. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted. Solis had been right all along. Humanity was no longer a passive observer in the cosmic arena. They were a player, a force of nature that no one could afford to ignore. But there was more to this victory than just the destruction of the Tarnix fleet. The Vanguard Eclipse had become a symbol, an embodiment of humanity's indomitable will. And it wasn't just the human soldiers who had earned the galaxy's respect. It was their stories. The stories of people like Val, the war hero who had once stood at the precipice of destruction and now found himself standing on the edge of something far greater. Val had been a reluctant participant in this war, torn between loyalty to the Union and his growing admiration for the humans. But now as he stood beside Solis on the bridge of the Vanguard Eclipse, he understood something that had eluded him for so long. The Union had underestimated humanity's strength, not because of their lack of firepower or technology, but because they had failed to understand one fundamental truth. Humans fought not just for survival, but for each other. The Tarnix had fought with pride, with honor, but they lacked the one thing that gave humanity its edge: community. Humanity had learned to fight as one, to unite their strengths, to rise above their flaws. As Val turned to Solis, their eyes met, and in that shared glance there was an unspoken understanding. He had seen it now, the power of unity, the power of a people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. They were not just soldiers. They were a wave, an unstoppable tide that would sweep across the galaxy, changing everything in its path. Solis's voice broke the silence. "We've won this battle, Val, but this is just the beginning. The Union will come for us, and so will every other power in the galaxy. They'll see us as a threat. They'll try to break us, but they won't. Because they can't." Val nodded slowly. The weight of the words hung heavy in the air. It was a promise, but it was also a challenge that would require everything humanity had, its ingenuity, its resolve, and its unwavering will to survive. Suddenly, a new transmission came through, breaking into the tense silence. It was a message from the Union Command, an encrypted signal from the very heart of their power. Solis stepped forward and activated the transmission, the face of a high-ranking Union officer flickering into view. His features were sharp, his eyes cold, but there was a clear sense of calculation behind his gaze. He had expected to see a vanquished fleet, to find the Vanguard Eclipse broken and burned. Instead, he found something far more dangerous, a new power on the rise. Brandy. "Solis?" The officer's voice was measured, yet there was an undeniable edge to it. "We've seen what your people are capable of. The Union will not forget this humiliation." Solis's lips curled into a faint smile, her eyes gleaming with the promise of more battles to come. "Then let them come," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "But know this, we won't be the ones running. You've just witnessed the beginning of humanity's ascent. We'll fight until the stars themselves burn out." The officer's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. He didn't speak again, and the transmission cut out abruptly. For a long moment there was only silence, thick with the weight of the moment. Val watched as Solis turned away from the screen, her expression unreadable, but her resolve shining. "Through like a beacon. They'll come," Solis said quietly, almost to herself. "But we'll be ready. Humanity's time is now." As the Vanguard Eclipse powered up its engines and turned toward the unknown reaches of the galaxy, the crew felt the weight of their future pressing down on them. They had proven themselves in battle, but what came next would define their place in history. The war was far from over and new threats loomed on the horizon. Yet for the first time, Humanity stood united, unyielding, and ready to face whatever came next. And in that moment, as the stars stretched out before them, it was clear no one would ever again underestimate humanity. They had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same. If you enjoyed this epic tale, be sure to like, share, and comment below. Let us know your thoughts, and tell us how you think humanity's rise will unfold in the galaxy.